This podcast, brought to you by Anchor, is currently non-profit making and is based on the second edition coursebook on international history from 1870 to 1945 for Cambridge International AS Level History. Welcome to the first episode of my new series, which focuses on the unit China and Japan, predominantly from 1912 to 1945. To begin, how did the communists gain control of China? The Qing or Manchu dynasty was weakening in the early 1900s and was eventually overthrown in the Wuchang Uprising of 1911, marking the end of Chinese rule by dynasties. There are a number of reasons for the weakening and eventual collapse of the dynasty. Firstly, China had been weakened by Japan in the First Sino-Japanese War in the late 1800s. Additionally, the dynasty had suffered by Western imperialism in China in the late 1800s. Thirdly, the traditional Qing dynasty was failing China in terms of modernization. The Republic of China was eventually established in Nanjing in 1912, with the first provisional president being Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Dr. Sun Yat-sen was one of the leading figures of opposition to the dynasty. Although he was not directly involved in the Wuchang Uprising, he had tried to overthrow the government 10 times since 1905 and had failed each time. Sun Yat-sen was in an alliance with Yuan Shikai, who had been a general in the Manchu dynasty. They made an agreement. The agreement would mean that if Yuan Shikai was able to make Emperor Puyi abdicate, he would become the president. Yuan Shikai became the president in March 1912, but in December 1915 he declared himself emperor, upsetting the Chinese who despised being ruled by emperors. He was forced to abdicate as emperor in March 1916, again becoming president before he died in June. The 9-year period following his death is known as the Warlord era. The imperial army would be required to pledge allegiance to the emperor. However, at this time the armies were being led by warlords, who were unwilling to pledge allegiance to Yuan Shikai. As a result, rule and control of the army was extremely fragmented, and there was a lack of centralized leadership. During the warlord period, Sun Yat-sen set up a revolutionary government from Guangzhou to Guangxi, with the aim of re-establishing the rule of the Republic in China. His movement is known as the Kuomintang. However, he sadly passed away in 1925 from cancer. The power that he held is passed on to General Chiang Kai-shek, who held much of the military power of the Kuomintang. From 1921 until Sun Yat-sen's death, there was a high degree of collaboration between the Chinese nationalists, the Kuomintang, the Soviet Union, and the Chinese Communist Party with the aim of deciding how China could unify. Essentially, the Chinese Civil War begins in 1927 when Chiang Kai-shek begins to take power over the various factions of China and goes after the communists and warlords. Meanwhile, in 1931, the Manchurian crisis occurs. This is yet another area of China that Japan has occupied, as they took Formosa and Korea during the First Sino-Japanese War. The occupation of Manchuria lasts until 1937, when the Second Sino-Japanese War commences. The Second Sino-Japanese War coincides with World War II, and the USA enters the war on the side of the Allies, with China, when Japan bombs Pearl Harbor. In response, the US drops atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, ending the war in the Pacific. The Long March takes place in 1934 when the Communists are almost defeated as they are surrounded by the Nationalists and forced to retreat. The Communist Party's military marched through extremely rough terrain towards the northwest of China. They marched from the province of Jiangxi to Yan'an in Shaanxi. During the Long March, Mao Zedong was able to create a greater role as leader, enabling him to take control of the Communist Party of China and eventually the whole of China. Back to the Sino-Japanese War. There was a break of full-scale civil war in China as they focused on fighting the Japanese. However, it resumed following the defeat of Japan. By 1949, the Communist Party was able to defeat Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, forcing them to retreat to the island of Formosa, known as Taiwan today, where they established a nationalist government of Taiwan. There are a number of reasons for increased support of the Communist Party. One of these is that the Communists were able to increase support from the rural population during their Long March. They helped peasants by paying them for food and resources, while they also took land and wealth from the rich and divided it among the poor. Secondly, the communists were able to expand their strength by fighting the Japanese invaders. In the end, they were very significant in the Sino-Japanese War. Finally, in the end, the party controlled around 100 million people and had an experienced army and had created an alliance between peasants, workers, the middle class, and smaller-scale capitalists. This meant that their power and influence continued to spread. Thank you for listening to another episode of my podcast. I will be releasing a few episodes today to start the new series, but also as I'm preparing for an assessment tomorrow. Bye, thanks again for listening.